our dear friend Roland Williams was down at a conference in Southern California. I kind of divide my time now that I'm semi-retired between Northern California and Southern California. The AA meeting I attend is just right up the hill. My sponsor lives within walking distance of here. I serve as Chief of Addiction Medicine at Centerpoint, addicts and alcoholics coming out of the criminal justice system. I like that because there my referral source is San Quentin. And it takes the ambivalence out of it. You see old Doc Smith or you go to jail. I found when you move up the socioeconomic ladder, people have a lot more options and of course a lot more opportunities. So I tend to now work on both ends of the spectrum. This whole concept of marketing is new to me. When I was with the Haight Ashbury Clinic, our marketing was there'd be an alcoholic on the street and you'd drag them up the stairs, or the Narcotics Bureau would say, you know, you go up those stairs and get detox or you go back to jail. The old free clinic old timers remember that. But one of the things that has highlighted to me is how widespread the alcoholism and addiction problem is. In other words, for 39 years when I was with the Haight Ashbury Clinic, I had this world. It's still our world. I can walk to every place I've lived and worked in the last 50 years in the Haight Ashbury. But the focus was on addiction in the Haight Ashbury. And it led to the belief in society as a whole, which is really untrue, that alcoholism and addiction is concentrated in certain areas. And that is one of the first myths. The leading cause of death and disability in our society is alcoholism and addiction. It's spread throughout our society, and the biggest increasing drug problems are occurring in rural areas. So it means that the delivery system has to be much more diverse. It has to involve a much larger number of people. Now, I know many of the people in this audience are therapists. My particular area has been to mobilize the medical community to deal more with addiction, because 100% of alcoholics and addicts will end up in the medical system. And one of the huge advances that is covered in our Journal of Psychoactive Drugs that is available at the front desk is the article on healthcare reform and parity. The world has changed dramatically, and yet I find the treatment field in many cases has not kept up with it. That doesn't mean that what you're doing is wrong, it's just that you're behind the curve. For example, the world is before healthcare reform and after healthcare reform. Parity means that every alcoholic and addict has equal access to the mainstream of health insurance. It means that you can no more discriminate against addiction by law than you can against diabetes and cancer. Now, discrimination is alive and well and will continue on, as we found out by the insurance companies trying to deny benefits, but now there is a law that allows a counteraction. You can sue insurance companies for discrimination against the treatment of alcoholism and addiction, just like you can sue insurance companies for discrimination against the treatment of diabetes and cancer. Now, that has been my 45-year mission in life. When I first founded the Haight Ashbury Free Clinic, as many of you know in this audience, and including my partner Rick Seymour, that we have a lot of this in books and publications and the journal. The Haight Ashbury Free Clinic was built on the principle that health care is a right, not a privilege. That slogan, which was a slogan with very little reality, we didn't have a whole lot of reality base in the 60s, a lot of fantasy, very little reality, was become the slogan of healthcare reform in the year 2010. In fact, during a big healthcare reform debate, they were debating, you know, the right wing was against healthcare, healthcare is a right, not a privilege. The left wing, which by the way is mostly up here in San Francisco. Another experience I've had in going down to Southern California and Orange County is I met Republicans. The Haight Ashbury is a Republican-free zone. In the voting booths, there are more Natural Plant Party members than there are Republicans. But Republicans are out there, and a lot of them are in Orange County. And they debate these issues vigorously. They are opposed to health care as a right, not a privilege. They don't know the ramifications of it. They might say, I'm for the treatment of addiction, but I'm against health care reform. That's a disconnect. The biggest advance in getting the healthcare system to have parity and take care of addiction is healthcare reform. Now, the devil is in the details. A lot will happen, but that's been a mission. And you need to be informed of that. You need to be informed of the ramifications and how that will impact your treatment programs, because the funding sources are going to change dramatically. There will be a move towards mainstream all treatment benefits and eliminate categorical grants, which many programs have built their basis on. It will mean that the primary care physician will be more and more the gatekeeper. And of course, that's one of the big hurdles. Most primary care physicians know very little about alcoholism and addiction. And yet, more and more, they will be the gatekeeper and key to whether individuals that have addictive disease have access to the mainstream of treatment. So educating the primary care physician, which is the mission of the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and the importance of you all learning how to work with the medical community and vice versa, them learning to work with you, is going to become central to this. So those are some of the broad issues. I urge you to look at this latest issue of our Journal of Psychoactive Drugs on addiction and related disorders, on healthcare reform and parity. Suzanne has copies of it back. We work together at our office. She also happens to be the mother of our 5-year-old granddaughter, but I wanted to show pictures of our granddaughter, but she overruled that. Another article there is on buprenorphine. The big advance was data 2000 and the ability to use Suboxone for the treatment of opiate addiction. There is a huge increase in prescription opiate abuse amongst adolescents. In fact, in the article that Scott and I did for Counselor Magazine, he has a copy of it here for those of you that want to keep up on that. We brought a lot of literature that may be new to many of you. This last year, drug overdose deaths, particularly prescription overdose drug deaths, based on work done by Bob DuPont in this article, the Journal on the Prescription Drug Epidemic, exceeded traffic deaths in adolescents. Number one cause of death is drug overdose deaths. So we have this epidemic. And this epidemic has hit here in Marin County. It's always a disconnect for me when I see a kid from Tam Highs, 20 years old, from a middle-class family, come in snorting OxyContin and gets busted. Well, the laws aren't supposed to apply to middle-class Marin County families. But what happens is they snort OxyContin, they get strung out, they come into San Francisco, they score their OxyContin at Turk and Ellis, the prescription drug block where you can get any drug you want. In fact, even it's kind of like a marketplace. They say pharmaceuticals on this block, organics on that block. You know, you want your heroin and your marijuana, you go to that block. You want your pharmaceuticals, you go to this block. It's like a bazaar of drugs. They get their drugs, their habits are big, they come back over here to Marin County, their habits have gotten big, they use part, they sell part, and they get arrested. by undercover agents, and then end up in Center Point with all the other diversion criminals from San Quentin. And their families are crying, and how can this happen, and it's not supposed to happen, and it's the type of stuff that many of you are very familiar with, but society has not dealt with that. We have this artificial line between legal drugs and illegal drugs, and the kids totally disrespect and blur that line. They're using everything all the time. And of course, the major source of their prescription drugs are the parents' medicine cabinet. So the healthcare delivery system and the addiction system is changing dramatically, and the drug epidemiology is changing dramatically. So it's crucial that we as a field keep up with that. Now, the whole idea for this lecture came when Roland Williams was down at this conference we had in Southern California. As I work with Scott Soul down at Newport Academy, it's been a very interesting experience because we're dealing with adolescents, the majority of whom have prescription drug problems. I give the family session because I kind of switch hats back and forth between my professional hat and my 12-step hat. And having a child that's had a problem, my wife and I know what it's like to suffer through the pain of having a child has a problem. In fact, my next book I'm working on is with Kathy Ketchum, who did Teens Under the Influence. Our working title is Hope, Family Guide to Addiction and Recovery. And we're going to share the experiences that families have had when they are in despair about this chronic, progressive, potentially fatal disease, and they find sources of help. And as I share with them and I help them, I use the 12-step adage is that me helping you is helping me more than it is you. That's the wonderful thing about this field, is that we give it back. And one of the things that is most satisfying to us is helping other families, because we know the despair and pain that they're going through. So down there, one of the people I work with is Dr. Dan Amen. Now, many of you know him. He's Dr. Dan, the brain doctor on PBS. We've known him for 20 years, worked with him in a variety of settings. He was very helpful to us early on. And he's been a pioneer in the use of brain scans. So what we decided in this collaboration is that the National Institute of Drug Abuse has declared that the decade of the 90s was a decade of the brain. Addiction is a brain disease, but the addiction field walks the walk but doesn't talk the talk. I mean, talks the talk but doesn't walk the walk. They treat it like a brain disease, but they know very little about the brain. So what we're going to do is to try to bring the latest of brain science to the addiction field, and then conversely, go to the general public and recognize that brain health is the key, and that a lot of their stigma relative to addiction is the failure to understand that addiction is a brain disease. So that was the collaboration. In other words, particularly those of us that have a 12-step basis, and obviously that's my bias and orientation. The big book of AA says it's a allergy of the body and a compulsion of the mind. And yet, so little of our field understands the basis of that. They practice it. In fact, much of what they do may be the right thing, but they don't understand the latest in brain science. Conversely, in working with the medical community and society as a whole, when they're fighting against benefits, they say, well, addiction can't be a brain disease because we don't know the cause of it. totally wrong. I say often wrong, but never in doubt. We know more about the biological basis of alcoholism and addiction than we do the biological basis of cancer or diabetes. We know exactly the sites in the brain and the dysfunction of the brain that is the causation of addictive disease and the consequences as the disease progresses. They say, well, and this is where language becomes a debate, it's a behavioral disorder. Addiction medicine does not like the view that addictive disease is a behavioral disease. We don't like the whole concept that it is in the behavioral health department. That would be like saying you should put Alzheimer's disease in the behavioral health department because people with Alzheimer's disease have bad behavior. Their behavior deteriorates because their brain deteriorates. The dramatic thing about addictive disease is that if you recover from addiction, your behavior normalizes. And now with the advent of brain scans, we can understand that progress and translate it into actions that are beneficial. The rate of knowledge relative to the brain is not just linear, it's exponential. One of the things that my daughter Suzanne does as I work on my PowerPoints is we get the PowerPoint finished and then I'm always bringing in articles. Our chairs are about 4 feet apart and she does the PowerPoint. You can thank her for what's on the board here. And right up to the last second, I'm bringing in a new article because there is so much new knowledge. And the thing that is dramatic relative to medicine, and what I must alert you to, is that at UCSF, where I'm a professor, the search did not start for the biological basis of alcoholism and addiction. In fact, they really didn't care much about it. When I first started the Haight Ashbury Free Clinic, one of my professors of medicine said, "David, where did you go wrong? You're always such a promising young medical student." If you went into addiction in the 60s, it was a sign of career failure or mental illness. When we treated addicts at our community-based outpatient detox program that was headed by Daryl and Nava, and many of the people here recognize that, starting in 1969, using the technique that my colleague Don Wesson and I developed called the Smith & Wesson phenobarbital substitution and withdrawal technique. We had to endure 40 years of bad Smith & Wesson jokes. It was a criminal offense to treat an addict with a scheduled drug by a doctor. In other words, what Deborah does here, what Alta Mira does in the 60s was a criminal offense. You could not do it. That's the dramatic change that we've had. The kind of the good news and the bad news, you really can't get arrested in San Francisco. You know, where you can, they just won't arrest you for anything. So we happen to be detoxing 100 addicts a day on an outpatient basis in the middle of this very liberal city, and all they cared about is they weren't dealing. I found this out because the undercover agents told me later they were on top of the roof across from Clayton Street photographing us as they come in, and apparently my picture and probably several of your pictures were all over the narc wall, and all they cared about is we weren't dealing. But that's not the rest of the world. And they arrested a doctor for detoxing an addict on Valium in Southern California, and that is the origins of the California Society of Addiction Medicine, later the field of addiction medicine. And of course, the dramatic thing about Data 2000, for the first time, an addict can be treated by a doctor in a medical setting legally using Suboxone. In fact, when I'm at Centerpoint and I'm detoxing patients, I say, you know what, a long way this has come. I can sit here as a doctor talking to you as a patient without fear of arrest. Now, I don't want to lapse into history, but it is crucial for people to know that this wonderful field that we have, all of us together, was built on blood, sweat, and tears. And at one time, we were outlaws, criminals providing health care to criminals. And given the attack on health care reform, that could all change. So be aware, there's a t-shirt in the Haight that says, even if you're paranoid, the bastards may be out to get you. So we want to move to the head, but be aware that there are forces that can compromise all the progress we've made. From a scientific point of view, we were involved in a study. That's what led us first into the HIV area. And my wife and I were doing it at Haight Ashbury Clinic, and we were studying IV speed. Remember, speed kills came out of the 60s. And we started seeing this new disease. They called it gay cancer. So that's what got us so involved so early in HIV disease. And at that time, we had a national conference. And one of the learned speakers got up and said that gay cancer is caused by drugs because gay people in the bathhouses use a popper. And there's a carcinogen in the popper. Well, our epidemiologist, Dr. John Neumeier, said that doesn't fit the mathematical model. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4, it's 1, 2, 4, 8. It fixes sexually transmitted disease. And that helped lead to an understanding that this was a sexually transmitted disease. Now again, why do I say that? Because you have a belief right now that you're absolutely sure of that in 20 years may be as wrong as HIV disease is caused by butyl nitrite. And you don't know what it is, and I don't know what it is. Therefore, the ability to review the scientific literature and advances is very crucial, because it is important to understand the progress of science to reinforce the things that you're doing that are valid. And one of the things that I have found, if you understand the scientific basis, the biological basis of addiction, and you have a skeptical patient, knowing the science, not the latest literature, but enough to explain it, reinforces the thing. If they argue with you, well, addiction's not a brain disease, knowing enough of the science to prove your point strengthens your clinical message. So that is the importance of the interaction of clinical skills and neuroscience. In the same basis, one of the things that I've done is look at the scientific basis of the clinical issues and work on trying to strengthen those. One of the things that Dan and I have done is try to introduce the concept into the lexicon of the addiction field as brain health. We deal with a brain disease. What we're after is healthy brains. What more powerful force to create a healthy brain is don't get too hungry, too angry, too lonely, too tired. In the latter part of our book, we talk about the title of this lecture, Creating Brain Healthy Families in Recovery. What more brain healthy activity can you have than the spiritual experience of helping others? Well, that's my opinion, but using SPECT scans, it can be demonstrated. The spiritual experience can be demonstrated biologically, but your brain has to be able to respond. You can't respond to the spiritual experience while you're loaded. The brain recovers in phases. The highest manifestation of brain health is helping others with the spiritual experience. But you have to have a healthy brain to do that, or progress towards a healthy brain. Now, this is a big debate. I know I just attended the International Doctors in AA, and they talked about the spiritual experience that Bill Wilson had, and some said it was the DTs, and somebody else said that they used belladonna for detox, and then they got into a huge debate as to whether an LSD-induced spiritual experience can be done. I'm not talking about the spiritual experience of hitting bottom and a hallucination. That gets you started. I'm talking about the spiritual experience as your brain gets healthy and you're healthy enough to help others, which means you got to take care of yourself to help others, and we can demonstrate that through brain reactions. We were talking before about craving. One of my dear friends talked about her craving. We can demonstrate craving in the brain. Craving is a biological event. It can be demonstrated and it can be extinguished by just not using. That area of the brain that serves as the biological basis for craving, if you don't reinforce it, will slowly normalize. Doesn't mean it'll go away, because in the brain, in the midbrain, there's an area called the amygdala that has encoded memory. Understanding that helps serve as the biological basis for when you relapse faster and harder than you did the last time. It's like a computer. When you reintroduce the toxin, the brain reacts like it's a toxin, and you relapse faster and harder than you did the last time. Now, AA says that, you can't get drunk if you don't take the first drink. Duh. But in the beginning, you got to keep it simple. One's too many, 1,000's not enough. But educated people wanted proof that that's true. And by reinforcing those areas of the brain where this serves as the biological basis for these simple statements, improves your clinical outcome. So that is the task that we have. And again, I'll be citing different, this came out of page 187 in this book on creating brain healthy families in recovery. In other words, I've elaborated on. By the way, we found out we autograph these books. If you buy an autographed book, it doubles in value. In fact, my daughter just pointed out that there's this the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs that was in the Whitney Museum from '66. She calls me up from New York and says, "Dad, your name is in this big museum in the Summer of Love." And I went on eBay and it sold for $80. And when we sold it in '67, it sold for $2. So if you think about it, that's done a lot better than your 401ks have done. So this is the part I'm going to take off on. Okay. We've got a system here. What do I have to do? Okay, so the focus here is on the family. Addiction disorders are very prevalent and produce a great amount of morbidity. This comes from the National Institute of Drug Abuse and emphasizes the patient denial and deception, which make it difficult for clinicians to initially discover addictive disorders. And I know that there's some of you that are struggling with that right now. And one of the things I've tried to do is to link up the people that are struggling with that issue with the caregivers in this audience. One thing I've found, there's a whole field out there that a lot of people early in their alcoholism addiction doesn't even know exist. In fact, what we see with these young people, they say, I don't even know somebody that doesn't get loaded all the time. They think their whole world is getting loaded. Well, there is a lot of people that can drink socially. I don't know them. I don't hang out with them very much, but they exist. And in the recovery field, there's a whole lot of people that are in recovery. So you have to introduce yourself to those new worlds. We emphasize that addiction should be seen as a prototype for chronic illness that affect families. Addiction is a chronic, relapsing, and potentially fatal disease influenced by genetic and environmental factors. It exactly fits the definition of a chronic disease. and family members can have a significant impact on the process of enabling the addiction to progress. The addiction cycle and the 4 C's, we actually evolved that in the 60s around methamphetamine. Craving, compulsion, loss of control, and continued use in spite of adverse consequences. That's the key, not physical dependence. It's not what you do when you don't drink, it's what you do when you do drink. The loss of control and continue on in spite of adverse consequences is the key early guideline. Craving and self-control are influenced by neurochemicals in the brain. And in the book, we go into great detail on how the brain is a chemical symphony of chemical reactions. You have the glutamate system, which is the accelerator. You have the GABA system, which is the inhibitor, and you have dopamine that regulates it. That's the neuronal cycle. There's some times when you want to push the accelerator, like when my daughter says, hurry up, get to Alta, Mira, take the dog home and pick up your wife. That's not a time to be relaxed. That's the time to push the accelerator. But when you're seeing old friends and you're here, then your GABA system kicks in and you're relaxed. But all this is regulated by dopamine. Accelerator, brake, regulator. It's like coming across the bridge. There are times you want to push the accelerator, you want to tap on the brake. You want to regulate it by dopamine. What alcoholism and addiction does to this neuronal cycle is dysregulated. It can knock your regulator off, your dopaminergic system. It can knock your glutaminergic system off, your accelerator, or you can knock your GABAergic system off. Different addictions dysregulate the neuronal cycle in different ways. This is called the reward system of the brain, and it's in the primitive area of the brain, not the prefrontal cortex. The thing that makes us uniquely human is this large prefrontal cortex that is where reason and judgment are. Addiction is not a rational process. It's in the limbic system. That's also the area that regulates food, sex, sleep. This is why there's this move towards the process addictions. The most powerful reinforcer known to man, or known to humankind, are psychoactive drugs. But sugar and high-risk gambling and high-risk sex does the same things. Not as strongly, but it does. So in this limbic system, they're called hedonic hotspots. And these hedonic hotspots light up. As you move, you're going to be able to make, right now our diagnoses are made by behavior. The one thing we know is that the reward system of the brain has varying sensitivity. And that sensitivity is influenced genetically. With early onset addiction and early onset mental illness, there is a phenomenon called polymorphism, where you have genetic tracks that are in common. With women, the genetics is for depression. With males, the genetics is for alcoholism and addiction. Down the line, what is happening, and this came a lot out of UCSF, they have the Human Genome Project, where they've identified every gene in the body, and they've identified over 400 illnesses for which there's a genetic basis. So in the future, they even have it now in research, a gene chip. So you're a clinician, and you have this broad brush of behavior. One of the advances is called biomarkers. You'll be able to do a gene chip, genetic readout, and biomarkers using brain scans in order to define risk, to help confirm the diagnosis, and risk for kids. Because of course, with all addiction, mental illness, and these others, we want to know risk for future generations. So another concept that you have to keep in mind is the advance of science with biomarkers. And right now, the biomarkers we use are very crude. The urine test. That's one example of a biomarker, but there's a huge number of potential biomarkers coming down the research pipeline. The problem is that what will happen is some new company will come up with one biomarker and say, this is the greatest biomarker on the face of the earth, you ought to buy it. And if you're not familiar enough with science, you're not going to be able to interpret that. Or know somebody in addiction medicine and science that can help you interpret it. Just like, for example, if I'm going to know something about monitoring, I call Monica and Millicent. Know what you don't know. There's no danger in asking questions. Maybe to the world you have to prove that you know everything, but to us you don't. And there's a lot of people out there that are marketing stuff, you know, get mine and it'll be the best. I know that this is one of the articles that Dan Amon has on the clinical use of brain scans in the treatment of substance abuse. The use of this has helped us understand things we couldn't understand before. In other words, what I work with most is early onset addiction. The peak incidence of addictive disease is between 15 and 21. If your onset of addiction is before the age of 15, the morbidity and mortality and severity of the disease is much more, and you need more aggressive intervention. We know that in studying other areas, there is a genetic basis to breast cancer, and if you're positive for this particular gene in breast cancer, you will have a much more severe and malignant course of breast cancer, and you have to intervene more aggressively. Right now, the diagnosis is made by size of insurance policy. You know, you might have a very aggressive onset of addictive disease early, and they say, well, try outpatient treatment first, and if that doesn't work, we'll do more. Well, they may be dead by then. So we have to make diagnosis more by biomarkers and severity of the disease. In other words, the way I'm thinking in addiction medicine, I'm not saying you should think like I do, but you should know how we think. We think like any other chronic disease. More and more you use biomarkers for virulent forms of prostate cancer, virulent forms of breast cancer. Thinking is start using biomarkers for virulent forms of alcoholism and addiction. That's in the beginning part. On the other end, there was a very interesting grand rounds at UCSF where late onset alcoholism and addiction. These are seniors that have the onset of addiction. They have no family history of alcoholism, no family history of addiction. They've been social drinkers all their life. Their dementia comes on, and they have the manifestation of alcoholism, prescription drug abuse, and interestingly enough, gambling addiction. In fact, I was talking with one, she said, that happened with my father. He suddenly started stealing our alcohol and trying to go out and gamble, but he couldn't drive, so we could stop him. What they found is with dementia, as the prefrontal cortex deteriorates, the dopaminergic system is uncovered and starts driving the individual. So again, by looking at science, we can explain things that heretofore have been unexplainable. In other words, we go on the assumption to develop alcoholism addiction, you have to have all these risk factors. How does that explain late onset alcoholism and addiction in the elderly? And what are the differing approaches for that population? I know we were talking with one individual to take on the elderly, and says we can't do it because of disability access. You know, you're not going to have a senior be able to climb up these steps if you want to take them on. You're going to have a different type of delivery system if you're going to start dealing with that population that's going to have a great deal more medical. So This is addiction as a brain disease. These are the areas of the brain that you should be familiar with, including the limbic system, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex. Every one of these areas contributes to the understanding of addiction as a brain disease. And in our book, we describe every area of the brain, the neurochemical function of the brain, and how that interacts with brain health. The key, of course, is brain health for the population as a whole and reestablishing brain health for those that have crossed the line into addiction. And I know one of the things that Dan is doing is working with brain healthy approaches to treatment. He's doing that with Newport Academy, coming in and giving specific brain health type of techniques. And again, much of what we already do, if you just put in brain healthy, that's what we're trying to achieve. That's what recovery's about. Achieving a brain healthy life. And of course, the first thing in a brain healthy life is quit abusing your brain. Next. The recognition that addiction is a brain disease is very important for families, because families, it's my fault, you know, if I had just done this, that wouldn't have happened. Society says, you must have done something wrong, parent, that's why your kid has a problem. The families, then they go talk to a normal family, whoever that is. I'm not quite sure what that is anyway. And they fake good, well, we've never had a problem, so you must be wrong. Well, that just feeds into shame, guilt, and humiliation. And recognizing that addiction is a brain disease and trying to eliminate the stigma is the first thing. We all know this, but I say to the families, check shame, guilt, and humiliation at the door. Talk to people like us. Go to Al-Anon. Stay with, in other words, if you have diabetes, who you want to talk to are other families that have diabetes. You don't want to talk to people and say, well, gee, I ate a triple hot fudge sundae and I didn't have a problem. My pancreas works just fine. You know, you must have done something wrong because your pancreas can't handle it. Well, that just leads to stigma, shame, guilt, and humiliation. One of the things we know that heavy drug use during critical times of brain development may produce permanent changes in the way the brain works. This is the stuff that's important for adolescents. And I'll just briefly talk about this because this is a very exciting neuroscience and learning. They have this at UCSF. They have a videotape on how a child learns. It's really fascinating because they said that if they tried to get physicists and physiologists to teach a child to use a spoon, it cost them millions of dollars. But when they see how a child learns, you got a spoon. Child practices and tries to do it. Put a little sugar in the end of the spoon. They put the spoon in the mouth. They taste the sugar, and the hedonic hotspot lights up. And then they repeat it. And pretty soon they're balancing the spoon so they can get the sweet in the tongue. If you don't put the sweet in the end of the spoon, they don't learn nearly as well because there's a neuronal circuit. Balance the spoon, get it into your lips, get it onto your, the hedonic hotspot lights up, and you repeat it. The most powerful reinforcer known to man are psychoactive drugs. So as their brains develop and their limbic system develops the accelerator develops faster than the prefrontal cortex brake, they use drugs. It reinforces the reward system in their limbic system, and they get off track so that the biological input, the thing that triggers their hedonic hotspot in their limbic system, are psychoactive drugs. First they use it because they like to, then they want to, and then they can't stop. That's crossing the line into addiction. And a neurochemical definition for addiction is a neurochemical alteration, the reward system of the brain, leading to hedonic dysregulation characterized by compulsion, loss of control, and continued use in spite of adverse consequences. In other words, once you cross the line, you don't feel right unless you're using. Your brain stabilizes when you stop using, but if you reinduce the drug, then your amygdala kicks in and you relapse faster and harder than you did the last time. And this early onset addiction is very crucial. The science that's coming out now is actually quite troubling. This part is a key for education, but there's all sorts of new science coming out. For example, heavy substance abuse and head injury early in the life cycle is correlated with neurodegenerative diseases. That's kind of the bad news. In other words, the heavy use of alcoholism and addiction appears to, particularly head injury and substance abuse, appears to increase the incidence of later onset neurodegenerative diseases. There's one very interesting finding that Lou Gehrig's disease may not have been classic Lou Gehrig's disease. It may have been the head injuries that he got. They're finding a cluster of individuals that have amyotrophic lateral sclerosis that emanates not from unknown causes, but frequent early head injuries. So I think this alcohol and drug abuse epidemic is going to herald, for the population that keeps abusing their brain, an increased incidence of neurodegenerative diseases. This is, how you deal with that clinically, I don't know, because I know when we're dealing with young people, you know, you may have early onset dementia. If you keep using, you may have ALS if you keep using, and they could care less about what's going to happen. All they care about is how they feel and how they look for tomorrow night. It's kind of like trying to get people to stop smoking. There's a neurobiological basis to cigarette addiction. In fact, that's the addiction that we know the most about in terms of hedonic hotspots. And if you smoke compulsively, there's a dramatic increase in your incidence of lung cancer. And the neurobiological basis of cigarette addiction is very clear. Interestingly enough, it's also an area that they're using brain scans for, where they're able to look at the craving center in the brain and using the brain scan and behavioral modification techniques to decrease the craving and calm down that area of the center. Now, some of you already do that with biofeedback. I heard somebody talked about acupuncture. There are techniques that are anti-craving in nature that we can do using these biomarkers to demonstrate the progress of it. Now, doesn't mean you've got to change what you're doing, but there's a certain population that if we can demonstrate that, they will be more ready to accept that. And this is decreasing craving through behavioral modification and reduction in that craving center, because craving always precedes relapse to addiction. Or I happen to be a sugar addict, and I saw that lady come by with that big pile of cookies, and if you saw me suddenly stop, my limbic system kicked off, and for about 2 seconds all I could think about was that big pile of cookies. As my sponsor knows, I can't even have cake at the end of the AA meeting because I want to eat the whole damn cake. There are controlled cake eaters. I happen not to be one of them. So this is the brain and its recovery. The most alarming problem is this dramatic increase in prescription opioids. We do not have a system that deals well with us. The night of 5, you can be negative on your drug screen and be loaded out of your brain on OxyContin and this, that, and the other thing. We work with Dominion Diagnostics, who has opioid screens. Who cut their teeth on this are those that work with the expanded panel, prescription opioid boys, Monica and Millicent. But if you have a traditional treatment program and you're using the traditional drug screen, you're behind the curve. I know down at Newport Academy they do screening for all prescription opioids because their adolescents are, you know, that's their big increase in problem. And I know when Mel and I worked together, we called it truth serum. You know, the doctors would come in, I am not using anything. Here's the urine test. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you about the Vicodin or the, you know, they always forget about the drug they're doing until you bring out the urine bottle. Next. Okay, these are the ones that are increasing the most. Next. This is across the life cycle. This is a lecture that I'm giving. I'm giving a talk on about the elderly to UC Davis, and I'm going to emphasize that latter part on trying to understand the late onset of alcoholism and addiction. Comorbidity with early onset, including serious mental illness. The separation of addiction and early onset mental illness, if you look at the brain, is an outdated paradigm. There is a common genetics and neurobiology to many of the substance abuse and psychiatric disorders. The problem is you don't know what came first, because high doses of substance abuse can alter the brain chemistry and reproduce depression and psychosis, or you can have early onset psychiatric illness like depression, and the Human Genome Project will help us answer that question. In other words, if it's just primary substance abuse, you go this way. If it's dual diagnosis, you go that way. If it's psychiatric illness with secondary substance abuse, you go that way. And of course, the treatments are very different, and the role of medication is very different. I know that this will help because there's a lot of early onset substance abuse and psychiatric illness in adolescents. There's just a big study came out about how they're being over-medicated. They're getting Risperdal, they're getting this, they're getting that, they're getting that, because now there's a trend in heavy medication of adolescents. It's kind of like who manufactures it, who markets it, how they can convince the psychiatrist to do it. And then, of course, the kids don't respect any of that. They take all those drugs and get loaded and smoke their weed and drink their alcohol, and their brains are a mess. So good diagnosis leads to good treatment. And the bottom line is a very small percentage of those that need treatment get it. Most people do not have access to the skills that are in this room. Thank God for those that do. But most people that have substance abuse and mental illness end up in the criminal justice system. The #1 delivery system in the United States for substance abuse and mental illness is the Los Angeles County jail system. What a tragedy. We have public policy of which we have criminalized this illness. And when you talk about socioeconomic status and ethnicity, if you get arrested for a drug offense and you happen to be African American, you have 10 times higher probability of getting a felony than if you're middle class and white. The current healthcare and drug policies are frankly racist in nature. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do with healthcare reform and parity. How can it be that if you're white and middle class and you have diabetes, you get treatment, but if you're black and socioeconomic and you have diabetes, you get jail? It's a big deal to get a felony conviction. And that's, of course, a huge debate that's going on now with California. I'm not going to tell you how to deal with that. I've changed my views, and particularly since I've been a grandfather and there's too damn many drugs, and not happy about all this marijuana around, but I'm also not happy that people get busted for marijuana and go to jail. And it's something we all have to think through. Very difficult. These are warning signs. Next. It's in the book. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. This is Unchain Your Brain, Developing Healthy Approaches, Prevention, Intervention, and Treatment. Again, what more brain healthy as approach is the standard thing we do in recovery. Don't get too hungry, too angry, too lonely, too tired. To improve your chances of preventing relapse, you have to get your whole family involved in retreatment. Scientific research has found that people who engage in couples or family therapy rather than individual therapy are less likely to relapse. That is sound clinically, but it's sound from a brain healthy point of view. The human being is a social animal. A healthy family is a calming influence, and you can demonstrate that in terms of brain imaging. Next. We emphasize the importance in our book of measuring specific goals, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, timely, and eliminating ants. This is a concept that Dan introduced. In fact, we spent hours and hours, him having his language and me having my language. In my world of AA, that's called stinking thinking. In his world, it's called ants. But the brain response to ants or stinking thinking is the same. It's not a pretty picture. This is the emphasis on widening the family support network and the extended family of living a brain healthy lifestyle. This is the benefit of effective treatment, including the promotion of physical health. And this is the part that the new science is really coming out. I'm going to try to conclude with this point. They have this new description called sarcopenia, which us seniors, I'm 71 on Social Security and Medicare, and I'm real interested in sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is deterioration of your muscles when you get older. And it turns out that an 80-year-old has 30% less muscle mass than a 20-year-old. It emanated from the concept of osteopenia. Osteopenia is bone deterioration. There's a certain amount of sarcopenia that occurs with natural aging, but brain inactivity is a major force in sarcopenia. Now, the reason I say that is to reemphasize this point that much of what you believe now may in 20 years be wrong. At least 50% will be. I don't know what 50%. It may turn out that what you do is the right thing, and by keeping up with brain chemistry, it'll reinforce what you're doing, but a certain amount of what you're doing will be totally wrong. A classic example of that is polio. They thought polio was a muscle disease. They had this huge network of treatment programs that said if you just exercise enough, your muscles will come back. In fact, Franklin Delano Roosevelt started the March of Dimes on the assumption that if he just got his muscles massaged enough, his muscle would come back. And then they found out that polio was a viral disease that destroyed the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and no matter how much you exercise your muscle wouldn't come back because it's a nerve disease. And you may be in 20 years going on the assumption that the causation of this disorder is A, and you do this particular technique to respond to A, and you found out that that is completely different. It's B. Now, it may turn out that experientially you've discovered the right thing. I happen to think, and that's my bias, I happen to think that AA has discovered universal truths. They just don't know why they discovered them, but they're true. But there's other things that are happening that are marketed, people pay for, that are not only ineffective, but are counterproductive. The clinician that keeps up on scientific advances will be able to interpret this, and those things that have a sound basis, you'll be able to get your skeptical patient. Remember, patients come in, they say, well, I've heard of A, and I've heard of B, and I've heard of C, and I've heard of D, and I don't know what it is. It's like that jerk on TV that's always saying about the cure, you know, just come to us and pay a lot of money and we'll cure you, you know. There's a lot of garbage out there, and an uninformed public doesn't know how to separate the garbage. That's what Dan and I are trying to do. Final slide. Next one. Okay, next. Okay, that doesn't come out very well, but that's a picture of Dan and I we signed all these books. Dan Amon, a dear friend and great clinician and thinker, and why we started this whole project of Unchain Your Brain and creating brain healthy families in recovery. So thank you very much.